started in the media? Do you have any knowledge of that? I know that some independent media started in the mid 90s. So there was a trend that when it comes to revolution, it all comes together. They change agendas, they move. So feel free to elaborate, give examples. So you could say, I'm going to talk about the region, the country that I know more, and in this case, Egypt. And so you can make a specific points on changes in the legislation, whatever you want to say. So I'll go with these questions. You elaborate the way you want. We're not going to interrupt you. There's not going to be an interruption because we want the solid response. And if there is any other question, I will do it a follow-up question.
Okay. And should I look at the camera or at her?
At her.
At her.
Oh,
Okay.
you look at me. Okay.
And the only thing I ask is, can we start by getting an ID from you? Just tell us who you are, any pertinent information we need to know about you.
Okay. So my name is Sahar Aziz. I'm an associate professor of law at Texas A&M University School of Law. I teach national security, civil rights, and Middle East law. And so I focus primarily on Egypt and the rule of law implications of the Egyptian uprising of 2011.
Perfect.
Ready?
Yes, ma'am. We're rolling.
Okay. Saha, no? Saha. Saha, in your view, what was the role of the national and local media in the Arab uprisings? I'm talking about here the governmental media, the emerging independent media. You can refer to globally to the MENA region or to the country that you know more.
Well, the uprisings that were triggered by the Tunisian Revolution were something that people knew were inevitably going to happen, but no one really knew when. So it caught a lot of people off guard in terms of timing and also in terms of its very rapid succession through the countries. But many of the underlying causes of these revolutions and uprisings were very well known. And the media had some role to play, particularly the international media and social media and internet-based media. Because although, for example, in Egypt, the media had started to become privatized in the 90s, those who had the money to purchase television stations, which is in Egypt and in many other countries where poverty is high, television is the primary source of information for most citizens. So most of the owners of private television stations in Egypt were members of the business elite. And many of them were also members of the predominant National Democratic Party, which was the party that essentially enforced the Mubarak regime's authoritarian mandate. So there was a conflict of interest. So although it was private and not officially controlled by the state, it was indirectly controlled by the state through the political relationships of its owners with the predominant political party and then with the authoritarian regime. So most of the impact of these new stations was mainly in expanding the type of entertainment, the type of movies, non-political commentary. But it was still pretty circumscribed when it came to talking about domestic political issues or issues that the Mubarak regime perceived as, beyond the acceptable norm. Now, with regard to the international media, particularly Al Jazeera, it was a very different story. So much so that many of the Arab governments did not like Al Jazeera because what it often did is it reported on issues that embarrassed the Arab dictators and that exposed what many of their citizens already knew: high unemployment, high poverty, high corruption, all kinds of domestic problems. But these were issues that the local media did not cover adequately, if at all, because they didn't want to empower the people. And then the private media also was very limited because they didn't want to lose their licenses, because that was another form of control that the state had over private media, is the licensing of media. So Al Jazeera, at least in terms of international media, was very influential because it was in Arabic. Because although you have BBC, you have CNN International, you have other international channels, most of them are in English. Now, BBC Arabic does have a pretty strong following in the Middle East, but Al Jazeera really had a dominant role in international media. Now you needed to have a satellite channel to do that. So you have a smaller group of people that would be watching Al Jazeera as opposed to the local, private, or local state. And then you expand to internet-based, social media, Twitter, Facebook, blogs. You had a huge increase, particularly in the early 2000s. And a lot of young people started to use blogs and Twitter and Facebook to communicate their grievances, to report on facts and issues that were happening in their countries that the government was not disclosing or trying to hide. And that certainly mobilized the middle class youth and to some extent the upper middle class youth. But again, you're getting now to a smaller pool because you need to have a computer and you need to have access to the internet. And so depending, again, that's why you're not going to have the working poor necessarily referring to those. But when you have a collective society, even if, say, the middle class has access to, the information online or satellite channels, that information can then be orally relayed. And at the very least, other people can then get an idea of what isn't being told to them by the state media or by the private domestic media.
Awesome. A lot of great content. Yeah, keep going. Keep going.
So with what you're saying, there was not an independent media. There was an emergence of a private media, but with really strong ties and strong connections to the government, and they control it because through licenses and so it was kind of an economic power, but there was not truly an independent media. So let's go back to Tahrir Square when the moment of the uprising start. That media, that independent media or any other alternative media, did they change the tone? Did they change the agenda? What happened in that moment? Let's go to January 2011. There was a change in tone, even though they were so connected to the government?
So it was a very rapidly changing situation. And I think throughout the uprising in Egypt, the state media, with maybe the last day or two, was showing pictures of the Nile, very peaceful and very quiet, as the country was literally on fire or politically on fire. And so it was very obvious that the state media was following the same strategy it had always followed, which was denial. But by then, very few people were even watching it. Most people were watching international media or going online. Or looking to newspapers that maybe were in Arabic that were published by the newspapers could be a little bit more independent because there wasn't as much control. Usually it was shut down, the newspapers would get shut down, but it was after the fact, whereas television channels, there was a little bit more control and the business elite were much more entrenched in the television industry, whereas newspapers you can start up, it's not as high of a startup cost. So, but that being said, you had the private media went through a transition. I think in the beginning they were doing business as usual, but it quickly became obvious that after the third or fourth day of the uprising that this was very serious. This was not just a protest that was going to be easily quashed by the regime, but this was a fundamental shift. And that's when I believe they started to show more of what was really happening on the ground. Another reason was because they realized that the people were watching Al Jazeera anyway, and BBC Arabic, and even CNN in English, because you could see the pictures. And people were living the reality, particularly in Cairo and Alexandria and many of the cities where there were protests, is you couldn't hide it from the people because it was literally outside in their streets. So towards the end of the uprising, you started to then see the private media be more accurate and also feel less afraid, because the regime was clearly falling. And the revolution, or what I'll call the uprising, was popular, was becoming popular. So the fear, the wall of fear was falling. And that had a lot to do with the reason why there was self-censorship involved. And then after the uprising in Egypt, after Mubarak stepped down on February 11th, you saw a huge expansion of media space. And it was very organic. People felt very liberated to speak. There were talk shows. I think there were more talk shows than Egyptians had ever seen, political talk shows, that were on the private channels, that were also on the government channels. No one really knew who the government was anymore. There was no longer the shadow of the dictator that you had to fear if you were an anchor on a state channel, because if anchors didn't follow the rules, they would get fired. Producers would get fired immediately. So the state media, I think, was still trying to figure out what its limits were and who the boss was. And the private media was the most unconstrained domestically and was leveraging the euphoria of the post-uprising phase to increase its viewership. And at that point, they were competing with Al Jazeera and the international Arabic channels. So you really saw a huge shift in openness that was being expressed expressed by the media and also demanded by the people.
So, following on the same point, so this you cannot look at the role of the media locally, internally, but it has to be in relationship to global media. It has to be in relationship to the new media technologies. So it's a bigger picture that we need to look at. So the local media could have not done the job themselves.
No, I don't think so, particularly not the state media. And I think the other point that's important is when the uprising in Egypt, and I suspect this applies to other countries that experienced an uprising or revolution, when they started, the number of people, particularly youth, who started to go to the internet for their source of information increased dramatically. So those who did have access, whether it was through their internet phones or through their computers at home, were now utilizing that access at a much, much higher rate. And they could watch YouTube videos, they could watch, they could read articles, and there was a lot of citizen journalism that was happening. Many of the youth, because they realized, they already knew, and it was confirmed that the state media wasn't going to report on what was happening. The international media had some limitations because they might not even have had a full understanding of what was happening. And so they started to engage in citizen journalism. And that also became another source of information.
Now, going back to the people, do you think that the uprising brought change on what could be the Egyptian public sphere? And if we add into this the situation of the fall of Morsi, has it changed anyway? Is it different now? Do you have more censorship? Did we went back? So what is the situation right now of the media, and what happened with the Egyptian public sphere?
Well, a lot has happened in the past 3 years in Egypt, and it's gone through multiple phases. And so you look at, it's primarily, I would say, 4 phases. The first is the post-uprising euphoria, which was probably about 4 to 6 months. And then you had another 6 to 9 months when the public spent a lot of time, particularly the youth revolutionaries and the liberal activists and the Muslim Brotherhood, trying to push the military, the Supreme Council on Armed Forces, back to the barracks because they seemed to be getting too comfortable with power and what they started out to be as a transition government and wanted to extend that. And then you had the election of President Mohamed Morsi, who was a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. And then you had July 3rd, which was a military coup that was arguably supported by a large segment of the population. And then they put in a military-backed interim government. And now, in April of 2014, you have a ramp up to presidential elections where General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was the head of the military, he was the Secretary of Defense, and also the leader in the coup of July 3rd, who is now the lead candidate, if not the only real candidate for the presidency. So a lot happened in each of those phases. I would say that it was arguably the most open in the first 6 months, 9 months after the revolution, because the country was celebrating. It was just enjoying the freedom. And those in power were either in jail, on the run, or trying to recoup. And so there really wasn't any centralized way to censor and any centralized way to quash the people's kind of desire to talk and debate and get out everything that they in prior years couldn't do, at least out through the media. I mean, people would obviously debate in their homes and in small groups, maybe in the streets, but to actually do it on television, to call in to talk shows, whether it's on the radio, it was something that, in my experience when I was there during that period, was very similar to what we experienced here in the United States. And what was most notable wasn't just the volume of discourse, but it was the ease in which people were comfortable in explaining their grievances and expressing their grievances and not feeling that they might get arrested, right, or that the channel might get shut down. But at some point, once the government started to get reorganized and once the levers of power started to solidify, you then started to see some reversion to the old tactics. And I would say that right now it's gotten much worse. I think since July 3rd, many of the same political actors are now starting to govern the state and following many of the same rules that Mubarak had followed. And they're using narratives such as patriotism, terrorism, national security, the public interest. So using those terms to censor and using those terms to also convince the public that those who are eagerly or earnestly interested in engaging in debate that may result in criticism of those in power are undermining national security, are supporting outside forces who are trying to bring down the state. And so that is also another kind of psychological way of producing self-censorship. And then you couple that with what's been happening since July 3rd, which is there are now estimates of over 23,000 Egyptians who have been arrested and detained. Many of them are in police camps. Many of them are in jails. And there have been stories of very bad torture and abuse that hark back to the same tactics that the Mubarak dictatorial regime used. So all of that contributes to official or unofficial censorship.
Two more questions. From the legal perspective, do you have any body of law that regulates this possibility to control the media? And that's one question that you can answer. And then the last one is, can you identify in all this uprising, which newspapers, which networks stand out as the one producing a transformation in the discourses?
So there are multiple laws. Egypt has a civil law system, which means everything is codified. All the laws are codified in a statute. So there are some codes that regulate the media. And some of them, most of the laws used to silence the media are either procedural or licensing administrative processes. So you can use, they usually will find pretextual reasons to say you didn't pay this or you didn't fill this form out, or they'll find some facially non-political reason to remove someone's license or to strip them of their license. So that was one tactic that was often used. Another tactic when you're going after specific journalists is defamation suits, libel suits, and oftentimes there may be something in the criminal code that would allow the government to detain the person pending trial. So even if it was a very weak case, you could harass them and strip them of their liberty temporarily by putting them in jail just through an indictment. And Egypt has a very unusual system. Well, it's based on the French system. It's very foreign to us in the U.S., where any citizen can file a claim, a criminal complaint against another citizen with the prosecutor general, and then the prosecutor general has discretion as to whether to pursue it. And so oftentimes those are very political decisions as to who to pursue. And so the state will then point to the case and say, we didn't file it. It was a private citizen that filed it. But oftentimes it's someone who's affiliated with the regime. So there are a lot of different ways that you can shut somebody up without having to admit that it's all political. But that said, the public is very cognizant of these types of games because they've The government's used them for so long. And the Egyptian public and many of I think the members of the Arab public of other countries understand they don't take seriously the government's pretextual claims when it comes to censoring the media. And they understand that the government does not have an interest in them knowing information that would be detrimental to whoever's in power, which is precisely why they tend, if they have the resources, to rely on foreign media.
My last question was, what are the main actors in terms of media, radio stations in Egypt that really orchestrate this, took it to another level? Newspapers, television network, radio stations.
You mean after the uprising?
No, during
the uprising
and until today.
Yeah, I think during the uprising, it was the international television media. It was the scenes. It was similar to the things that we saw here. It was seeing the pictures of people getting shot in cold blood, people getting run over, the horrendous abuses by the state. And it was also seeing the millions and millions of people out in the streets engaging in nonviolent protests, which is a very powerful statement. And so Al Jazeera played a very big role. I think CNN also played a big role. I don't know if you remember, but Anderson Cooper covered this quite a bit, and then CNN International picked it up. BBC Arabic covered it. I mean, if you'll recall, this was the primary international story. And so Egyptians were watching their screens just as the international community was, and many of them were living it and joining. And in fact, the more they saw it, the more they were emboldened to go and join it. So I would argue that it was really the international news media. Now, I should note that at the moment, Al Jazeera is completely vilified in Egypt and, in fact, has been banned. And that is because when former President Morsi was deposed on July 3rd, Al Jazeera's coverage was just as stinging as it was of Mubarak's regime during the uprising. And the military-backed interim government was very quick to silence that. And so they now have arrested their journalists, and there's a lot of coverage on that right now about how they're prosecuting them for allegedly supporting a terrorist group, because the Muslim Brotherhood was subsequently, in December 2013, designated as a terrorist group. And so just the mere fact that they were covering the story or covering the events in Egypt in a way that the current government viewed as sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood was a basis for their arrest. They also told the public that Al Jazeera is a threat to national security, that all their coverage is aimed at destroying the state and creating chaos. And the reason why that resonates at this particular moment is because many Egyptians supported what happened on July 3rd, 2013, which is a textbook coup in terms of a legal analysis, because the last 3 years had brought a lot of insecurity. The economy had actually gotten worse rather than better. The police had withdrawn from the streets, purposely so. There was a lot of political fighting between the Muslim Brotherhood that was controlling the presidency and other political stakeholders. So many of the members of the public thought this was not why we had the uprising. And they felt that things were worse rather than better. And they blamed the president, because he was the president of the country, and oftentimes that's who gets blamed when things go bad in a nation. And so many of them were eager for a change. They didn't necessarily want the country to be run by a military general, but they were very eager to get rid of him. And so that has made it much easier for the current government to portray anyone associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, or anyone who's sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, or anyone who doesn't even buy into the official government narrative, as a threat to the country. And I think what is really interesting, and certainly most notable from a media perspective, is this might be one of the first times in recent history that the government, and particularly the military, has been aggressively using the media to kind of get ahead of the narrative, to portray the narrative. So instead of just quashing and silencing counter narratives, they've actually taken the lead and to tell the people, here's what's happening. And in such a way that is not as obviously biased, but it's very interesting. It's almost as if they have their own media PR group within the government that has learned that they now have Facebook accounts, they have Twitter accounts. They are very active in controlling the narrative. And I think that is a very fascinating development that I would argue warrants further inquiry.